Today, I'll talk a little bit about cellular health, the health of your cells and your tissues, and how we can improve that. Now, there is, as you know, we expect to see a deterioration in our health, in our functions as we get older, because as we get older, many of our cells show the signs of aging, and they show it in many detailed and very interesting ways. Interesting if you're a scientist, not necessarily so interesting if you're suffering from the ill effects of aging. People know about the loss of telomeres. These get shorter with every cell division, and that has had a lot of publicity. Not too important for most people. Changing patterns of DNA methylation, that is the so-called epigenetic clock. One of the sciences that actually my mother was one of the very first people involved in this, and you'll still see her name in many of the early papers in epigenetics. Changes in the way in which RNA is processed, changes in the way in which proteins are formed and removed. The control of protein is in the cell is called proteostasis, and we lose that control as part of the aging process. You see reduced growth factors. We become less able to heal, to regenerate, reduced autophagy, and that is a way in which the cells clean themselves, a kind of household cleaning, housework. Reduced resistance to stress, and that's partly because the body is less able to produce stress-responsive proteins called alarmins. But perhaps most important, for most people, we see increased signs of inflammation. And this is really important because once you have increased inflammation in the body, all of those other things get worse. Inflammation is perhaps the most important driver. And as it creates and enhances the aging process, more and more cells become senescent. So these are aged cells which are not functioning very well, and they, in their turn, start to produce inflammatory mediators. And so this process of inflammation around these aging cells tends to become worse. It feeds on itself, and we move into a pattern of chronic inflammatory stress. So this is really a very large part of the aging process itself. And if we could find a way to control the inflammatory process and to reduce inflammatory stress, then we would be doing a great deal to slow down the entire aging process. Now, at this point, we have to talk about inflammation, how to control it. And this is something I talk about a lot. So for people who haven't heard this before, perhaps there'll be something new for you. But for those of you who have heard me speak on previous occasions, it's the old familiar stuff. So you can switch off, you can go and do some gardening, read a good book, or catch up with your sleep. We have to start with diet. Diet is the most important thing. And this is something that's monitored regularly by the US Institute of Health Metrics and Evaluation, one of the few institutions in America that still seems to be working reasonably well. And they monitor global patterns of health and disease. And they're working with huge data, metadata, and they regularly come up with statements like this. The most important cause of early death worldwide is poor diet. Now, early death means basically that the aging process has been running too fast. You've reached that end stage before you should have done. It may have manifested as a cancer, a cardiovascular disease, diabetes, but whatever is happening, it has driven the inflammatory process too fast. You've reached the end of your lifespan, and chronic inflammatory stress that I was just talking about is really the most important aspect of this. It makes us sick in all kinds of ways. It's making us stupid because it damages our ability to form new neurons and new nerve connections in various parts of the brain. And this very sad graph is in fact a meta-analysis. It's a summation of many, many studies of intelligence measurement, and it shows pretty unequivocally that we're all becoming more stupid. Average IQ is falling. And you can see from 1950 to 2020, where we are now, more or less, we've lost an average 15 IQ points. And you only have to look around you. My God, look at what's happening in the media to see the negative implications of this working their way out on the world stage. And the really terrifying thing is there's no sign of this slowing down. The world's diet has now become so bad that if we continue in this way, by the year, say 2090, that's not that far away, you can see that our average IQ will have fallen to below 85. And that is really where educational subnormality starts to show. This is idiocracy in the real life. The other problem that I think we have to deal with seriously is the loss of fertility that we're now experiencing in almost all parts of the world. All parts of the world where a modern diet is eaten. Now, the only areas in the world where fertility is not falling are those parts of the world, such as Central and most of Central Africa, where the diet does not consist of large amounts of ultra-processed food. They're not suffering from a reduction in fertility, and we're seeing all kinds of social problems as a result of that. But everywhere else, fertility is falling in men and in women too. I write about that in my blog. And testosterone levels are falling. Estrogen levels are changing in women as well. There is a huge sexual confusion going on. And it's not unrealistic to say that if we continue in this route, eating this dreadfully unhealthy modern diet, the end of our own species is in sight, or at least the end of civilization. At the core of it, you have this. This is the inflammatory process. And as you can see, it's quite simple. These are all the things that are going on inside immune cells, and immune cells are key drivers of inflammation. And a lot of this is quite well understood, these basic elements at least. Of course, there's far more to it than this. This is a very simplified diagram. But we don't have to focus so much on what is happening inside the cell. Let us concentrate on what is happening outside the cell. And that is the bar at the bottom of the graph labeled inflammasome. That is an area where we can intervene easily, cheaply, and very effectively, because that is where the omega-3s and the omega-6s and the polyphenols and the other tools that we use, that is where they come in. So this is a diagram of an archetypical cell membrane. That parallel line across the top of the picture represents a schematic cell membrane. And in that cell membrane, whether it's an erythrocyte, or it could be a cardiocyte, it could be a neuron, you have lots of fatty acids that are built into larger molecules, and you have omega-6s and omega-3s. And over on the left, you can see arachidonic acid, which is an omega-6. And over on the right, you see EPA and DHA, eicosapentaenoic acid, docosahexaenoic acid. And they are omega-3 fatty acids that we can make to a limited extent in the body, but which mostly we get from seafoods. Now, you need to have both in your cell membranes because we have to be able to create inflammatory responses, appropriate inflammatory responses. So if a challenge arrives, and it could be a bacterium, it could be physical injury, you need to start the inflammatory sequence, which we do with the arachidonic acid, the omega-6s. And then once the threat has been resolved, then we need to stop that inflammation, which we do with the omega-3s. So this is rather like the accelerator and the brake on a car. You need both. If you're negotiating heavy traffic, of course, you need both. And if you're negotiating the heavy traffic of life itself, where you're constantly being presented with challenges and you're constantly having to deal with them, you need to have the accelerator, the omega-6 arachidonic acid, and the brake, EPA and DHA, in your cell membranes, which means you must have them both in your diet. That's where you get them from. And you need to have them in the right proportions. This is another way of looking at how inflammation works. This is that cell membrane, and in the cell membrane, it's the ratio of omega-6s and 3 fatty acids that's really important. And let's say a challenge comes along, and I start to develop the inflammation cascade, and those immune cells start to shed little particles outside into the extracellular space. They're called exosomes, and they contain all kinds of things, including matrix metalloproteases, MMPs. These are enzymes, very destructive enzymes, and they damage the microfibers that hold all your cells together and give structure to your tissues and allow your tissues to function. When these networks are degraded, tissues start to age. So this is a sequence with two chambers, an upper and a lower. It's a simplified version. And in the upper chamber, it's the omega-6s and 3s that determine how hot it runs. But in the lower chamber, it's the presence or absence of these compounds, and they're called polyphenols. These were the subject of a great deal of research by one of my scientific heroes, Albert St. George, a great eccentric Hungarian chemist who won a Nobel Prize for his work on vitamin C. If you're eating a healthy diet with the right levels of omega-6s and omega-3s and the right amounts of polyphenols, you will be able to mount an inflammatory challenge and response to a challenge when you need to, but it won't be excessive. That's the essence of good health. The problem is that the modern diet damages us in all kinds of ways. And one of the ways in which it does that is it gives us a very high omega-6 to omega-3 ratio, which means that the first part of this inflammatory sequence is overheating. The second way in which the modern diet damages us is that it removes the polyphenols. 100 years ago, people consumed in their diet 10 times more of these polyphenols than we do today. They're largely gone. And that means that the second compartment in this inflammatory cascade is also overheating. And so your cells, your immune cells, are continually releasing a lot of these enzymes, these matrix metalloproteases, into the tissues, and they are dissolving them. They're breaking your tissues down. Because those matrix metalloprotease enzymes are destroying this. This is the extracellular matrix, and it's one of the most recently discovered physiological systems in the body, and it's absolutely crucial for your health. It consists of lots of microfibers. Collagen is one. Actually, there's 8 or 9 different types of collagen, so those collagen beauty products that many of you use are completely useless. And these microfibers run through every single cubic micrometer of your body, holding all of your cells together in the correct orientation so they can speak to each other and function collectively. And that is what a healthy tissue has to do. But if your immune cells are continually pouring matrix metalloprotease enzymes onto this mesh, then the collagen dissolves. And so do the other fibers too. Elastin, laminectin, proteoglycans. There are many of them. This is a very complex system. And once this matrix starts to break down, the cells in it can no longer function properly. They start to show more signs of aging, and the tissue itself starts to break down, and you start moving towards the destruction of entire organs. So a cartilage plate dissolves, and you have osteoarthritis. Bone dissolves. The linings of your arteries start to break down. Now, these enzymes, the matrix metalloproteases, are exactly the same enzymes that are produced by the so-called flesh-eating microbes. And they're pouring lots of these very destructive enzymes into the tissues in a very short period of time. And as you can see, they dissolve everything. Skin and bone and ligaments, I mean, absolutely everything. It's like being dipped in acid. And it is those same enzymes that are being released in much smaller amounts over periods of many years that leads to the slow destruction of healthy tissue that we call chronic non-communicable degenerative disease. We have a substantial problem today because the levels of omega-6s to omega-3s have risen considerably since 1900 due to technical developments. And instead of being 2 or 3 to 1, which is where good health resides, they have increased to an average of 15 to 1 in Europe, North America 25 to 1. In some other parts of the world, they are even higher. And our polyphenol intakes have declined because, firstly, we're not eating as much fruit and vegetables as we used to. 100 years ago, 10 portions a day was very common because people required many more calories and had no ultra-processed foods. And they also consumed fruits and vegetables which were intrinsically richer in these compounds. We have changed these plants by using selective breeding techniques, in some cases using genetic modification. And what that means is that our intakes of these very, very important anti-inflammatory nutrients have fallen by about 90%. So our inflammatory cascades are much more active than they were 100 years ago. We have more chronic inflammatory stress. Our cells are aging more rapidly. Our tissues are aging more rapidly as well, which is why there is so much early death these days, preventable death caused by these mass murdering companies here. Only a small number of companies control the larger part of the international food space, and they produce ultra-processed foods, long shelf life, cheap to make, high profit margins per square foot of shelf space in the multiple retailer. And they taste good. We love them because they are designed to taste good. Actually, they're designed to be as addictive as possible because these companies don't care about our health. What they care about is selling as much of their slop as they possibly can. And this is killing us because these foods have a high 6-to-3 ratio, extremely high, pathologically high. The polyphenols have gone. A very important fiber called prebiotic fiber has been removed, and these compounds have too. So these are your 4 most important anti-inflammatory nutrients, all gone. And in their place, these foods have been filled with these compounds, ages, ales, LPS, we don't have to go into that, which cause inflammation and which cause also the loss of proteostasis. Sorry about the jargon. What that means is your cells can no longer adequately maintain protein quality control. And so the cells themselves start to accumulate malfolded proteins, which impedes their functioning. The cell aging itself starts to accelerate, and then they too start to produce more inflammation. We keep on coming back to inflammation. We're eating far too much sugar, far too much carbohydrate. We really need to move to a lower carbohydrate lifestyle. Not necessarily ketogenic, but certainly lower carb. And this is also pro-inflammatory, and we're eating far too much sugar, yada, da, da, da. So for all of these reasons, we have chronic inflammatory stress, not just as individuals, but right across society, because we all these days eat that modern diet, which not only creates chronic inflammation, which causes increased cellular aging, increased breakdown of tissues, but at the same time, this modern diet starves us, gives us lots of calories, but it doesn't give us enough vitamins or minerals. And that's why it's different from classical malnutrition, which was often accompanied by starvation. These days, we have enough, often more than enough of calories, but we don't have enough of anything else. And it looks like these kids here. They're eating burgers, shakes, fries. They may like that food. It's designed to be addictive. Actually, there's good evidence that it really is. But while they're cheering on their football team or whatever the heck it is they're doing, they are developing chronic inflammatory stress. They have type B malnutrition. They are already growing the seeds of chronic degenerative disease, which in a few short decades' time will become clinically obvious, will make them sick, and will kill them, many of them before their time. We know what ultra-processed food is. It's food where you look at it and you can't recognize it. You don't exactly know what's in it. Typically, it has 6 or more ingredients, sometimes many more. And we know that it makes you fat. because these foods are designed to do just that. High calorie density, but none of the things such as fiber, which help you to feel full. So you don't feel full. You eat too many of them. The more of these ultra-processed foods you eat, the larger you get, which creates this paradox. The largest people who are eating the most calories are doing that in ultra-processed foods, and they have the worst nutritional status. One reason why being so fat is so unhealthy. It turns out that the more of these ultra-processed foods you eat, the more you die. It increases and accelerates the aging process. It increases and accelerates all those subcellular systems that I was telling you about right at the beginning of my talk. And therefore increases inflammation, and therefore increases not just the aging of cells, but the aging of the tissues and organs in which those cells are located. Our entire aging process is being accelerated. This was a beautiful paper in the European Journal of Preventive Cardiology, and this particular group, it's a Dutch group, have published many papers since then, but what they have showed is that we are aging more rapidly than our parents or indeed our grandparents were, because in large part of chronic inflammatory stress and this terrible diet and lifestyle that we have created for ourselves, which is why life expectancy is falling. It has been so for 4 years in the United States. It's falling again now, thanks to COVID. Not just viral deaths, but there have been increasing deaths of despair, increasing numbers of deaths relating to stress, and people who are so paranoid, thanks to an out-of-control media, that they're not going to hospital or to clinics to have their or other healthcare issues addressed. And we know that these increasing falls in life expectancy will come to those other countries where you're eating large amounts of ultra-processed foods. In Germany, as you can see, at 46.2, Belgium, 44.6% of calories in ultra-processed foods is pretty close to the UK, and it's going in the direction of North America. So we are going to start to see life expectancy falling in many parts of Europe too. The best thing you can do is change to a Mediterranean diet. We know it's very protective, or you can switch to a mid-Victorian diet, which is even better, which was good for historical reasons. I mean, firstly, we had the agricultural revolution, then the technical revolution, so lots of food, fresh food being produced in the countries, being brought into the cities where people work, and they're working physically. Very, very hard, lots of calories being burnt, 60 or 75 hours of physical activity a week, which means they required a lot of calories. Men up to 7,000 calories a day. And yet they're all very slim because they are burning those calories in physical activity. They're not eating much salt, not using much tobacco, very little spirits, very little processed foods, very simple ones, bread and cheese, but no ultra-processed foods, none of the junk that we eat today. Lots of omega-3s, not too much 6s, lots of polyphenols. It's an extremely anti-inflammatory diet, a very healthy diet. It is a super Mediterranean diet. And that affects their health and their life expectancy. Now, women today are living on average about 3 years longer. We're looking at very specific socioeconomic equivalent groups here. And that's to do with improvements in family planning and obstetrics. But men have actually lost life expectancy. And we have also lost health expectancy. It's typical now in the developed nations to spend the last 10% of your life becoming progressively sicker, more medically dependent. In the 19th century, they did not age like that. People remained healthy, entirely healthy, until the very last weeks or days of their lives. And when they did die, it was mostly from overwhelming infection. They had very little degenerative disease. Other people have looked at this, and you can see here in 1997 that the main causes of death are cancer, that's the black part of the column, and then above that you've got diseases of the circulatory system, so heart attacks and strokes, things like that. And you can see that they are responsible for about 2/3 of deaths today. But in the 19th century, they were almost insignificant. They did occur, they were recognized, they were diagnosed, but they just weren't important because that population ate such a healthy diet. They had no out of control inflammation in the way that we do. Their cells and their tissues did not age in the way that ours do. And they did not age at all in the way that we do today. This is just an overview of what was in their diet and lifestyle and isn't in ours to show why we are much more at risk of cancer than they were. Cancer was very rare in that community. And this is something that I use to teach doctors with because it goes into some of the details. But the main point I want to make is that whereas the Victorians were extremely protected against cancers, we have become extremely vulnerable. All of our defenses against cancer have been degraded by the modern diet, which is why cancer is so universal today. When we all know someone, we all have a friend or a relative who died of cancer or who is suffering from cancer. But in the Victorian era, it was extremely rare. So much of the chronic degenerative disease that we see today, personally and at the public health level, is completely avoidable, about 90% based on the data that we have. So let's take a typical 21st century person. And let's say this is, I don't know, Joe Biden, who seems to be suffering from the early signs of dementia, and probably because he's eating a modern ultra-processed diet, which means he has a very high 6-to-3 ratio and is not consuming enough polyphenols. So he has chronic inflammatory stress, and it's showing itself up in many different tissues. When it occurs in the joints, we call it osteoarthritis. When it occurs in the heart, we might call it coronary artery disease or essential hypertension. It could be non-alcohol related fatty liver disease. It could be asthma or chronic obstructive lung disease if you're a smoker. And in the brain, it shows up as depression. It seems to contribute to epilepsy, and it is certainly a core component of neurodegenerative diseases such as Alzheimer's and Parkinsonism. What should we do with a subject like this? There is an alternative, and in the bottom left of the picture, there is a clue: balance oil, because balance oil is a very potent anti-inflammatory pharmaconutritional tool. It puts the omega-3s back into the system, it puts the polyphenols back into the system, and is extremely effective at reducing chronic inflammation in most tissues. In fact, almost all tissues, with one exception. That is the gut, where we cannot reach that with balance oil at all, but we can talk about that on another occasion. In the meantime, what do we do about getting back into balance? The first thing you should do is to test yourself. We have the balance test, which is a self-use test you can do at home, which is an extraordinarily profound window into the health of your cells, and in some ways into the age of your cells, because the more inflammatory stress there is in and around the cells, the more rapidly they age. So we can switch that off using balance oil, and you can track that progress that you make by retesting. There are a couple of books which you can, these are in Hindi, I believe, and you can see there the price, $495. Don't be alarmed. These are not the prices in euros or dollars. They are the prices in rupees, which makes them much more reasonable. I'm very worried about overstaying my welcome. I think I've probably come to the end of my time limit. So perhaps there is a limited period of time for questioning for anyone who wants. I don't know how you've structured this event. If there is, I'm happy to take questions.